Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Cryptids of the Week video. Thought I would mix another one of these in here while I'm doing your Urban Legends videos. So thank you so much for those suggestions. I'm going to continue to do those for maybe about the next 2 weeks or so, and then I'll wrap up that series. So please keep them coming. As far as this random page, it has to do with an entry that surprisingly enough I haven't talked about before. In fact, I look at some of my past history just in case, and sure enough, I hadn't talked about it. So what a welcome relief it was to look at the info associated with this cryptid, the history as well, and see a lot of fascinating stuff, including the idea that this cryptid, even though it's commonly associated with being evil per se, it's not really evil. It's more like just a harbinger of doom, a messenger of death, in other words. And then, of course, there's also the association it has on a bunch of other properties, including one I'll talk about that I've known it, at least when it comes to comic books. So it has to do with this. It's the well-known cryptid as known as the Banshee. You've heard of it. I've heard of it. So here's a good video that'll showcase at least some of the origins and some of the history associated with this cryptid. So what is this Banshee? The Banshee is a well-known cryptid. It's a female spirit of sorts that is seen throughout multiple parts of the world. It's here in the United States, but it's also in other parts of Scotland, other places as well. It's one of those cryptids where, for whatever reason, lots of places do not have like a single spot just for it. You know how I talk about that in some of my past cryptids, where you have to go to one spot only in this world, and that's where that cryptid is. No, in this case, you can find it throughout multiple parts of the world. So very, very fascinating on that part. And it's a cryptid that is, for all those locations, it seems to have a singularity when it comes to its characteristics. So even though it's known throughout multiple parts of the world, it still has the same characteristics here and there. As far as its origins, it's not known when the very first sighting, the very first explanation of the Banshee started. All that's known is that it's been going on for a long, long time, centuries in fact, so much so that it's pretty much been a staple of Irish folklore. Like if there was something that could be considered its origin, it'll be closest to that. And that somewhere along the way in the history of Ireland, that's where it started. And it could be tied, in fact, to one of the 5 major families that started there in Ireland: the O'Grady's, the O'Neills, the O'Briens, the O'Connors, and the Kavanaghs. So for whatever reason, those families started to house this Banshee. And there was the idea that this Banshee, each family had a separate Banshee, and then each one of those families, once they started blending in with other people, they would in turn create, interestingly enough, their own banshees there. And then I'm going to add a little bit twist on that. Maybe once those families started spreading throughout other parts of the world, maybe that's where we see so many encounters with the banshee throughout multiple parts of the world. But as far as the characteristics of the banshee, here it is. It's pretty much been described singularly as a woman, and this woman tends to be very pale, has this skin almost like rotten, if you will. It has stringy grayish hair, rotten teeth, these eyes that are considered very piercing. It's not pleasant to look at, in other words. This is something that is truly a vision that you don't want to see out there. In other ways, though, it's almost described as a young woman, long reddish hair, almost like if it's like a trap of some sort. So at least with that regard, that's the least common way. The more common way is the one I mentioned earlier about being a woman that's almost like a zombie, but still something that is still seen throughout multiple parts of the world in that fashion. And then there's, of course, the biggest thing involving the banshee, the reason why it's known this way. It emits this scream, this very, very loud scream that everyone can hear. It's almost like a wail, and it goes into some other type of realm when it comes to its scream. So some people hear it as a wail, some other people hear it as a straight out murderous scream. Other people actually hear it more along the lines of singing, not like humming or anything like that, but more along the lines of a large amount of singing, and that ties into its its origins here that I'll mention more in a minute. But this whale is not seen as a good sign. That's the other telltale sign of this banshee. That's why so many people fear it and consider it evil, even though it's not necessarily evil up front, at least the way I read it. Because the way the story goes is this: if you see this banshee, or more importantly, if you hear this banshee, then because it's a messenger of death, then somewhere along the way, who knows if it's soon, who knows if it's later, you're going to die. So you're going to be able to have something happen to you, whether it's by accident or by some force of nature or by something else more nefarious. Like, let's say somebody murders you or something else happens. You are going to die because this banshee is letting you know ahead of time. So if you kind of twist it a certain way, it's kind of like letting you know, hey, you have a little bit amount of time left now. She's letting you know about that ahead of time, so you can start getting your affairs in place. Like, you can start creating your will, if you will, or you could start making sure you get all this stuff off your bucket list. Whatever is the case, the banshee is just warning you about that. She is not causing the actual death itself. That's something that I read that was very important to note. She's not going to cause whatever is going to kill you. She's not going to create it as well. She's just simply there to let you know that it's going to happen. And when that does, you don't know when or you don't know what's going to happen. At least she's telling you that information up front. You see how it looks different when you think about it that way when it comes to the banshee. So again, not necessarily evil, but more on the lines of just a messenger. Of course, the way she looks and the way she screams, that's where people just get freaked out, and rightfully so. But still, that's the whole idea of it. And then another interesting thing that I read in the past was that if you have a group of people, the only person that is truly the one that's going to be facing their doom soon is the one that sees or hears her. So you could be in a group, and if you don't see or hear anything, you're good. But if the person next to you, if your buddy next to you does, then that's where they run into some kind of issue. Another interesting thing I read is the banshee does not like to have eyes placed upon her. So she likes looking at people from afar, but in turn, they don't like being looked at. So another telltale sign, if you see her around, is if you're looking in towards the area, you know how you get that sixth sense feeling where somebody is just staring at you, maybe in the darkness, somewhere off in the distance, but you can't quite tell what it is. If you look and you keep staring, and then all of a sudden you see like this puff of smoke, and then you hear this fluttering sound, almost like a fluttering sound of a large amount of birds, or maybe even some kind of butterflies, like a large amount of butterflies. Whatever is the case, if you hear that, then that is also then the notion that there was a banshee right there nearby. Maybe she wasn't looking at you necessarily, maybe somebody passed your distance, but still, that is a good indication that you just were in the area of a banshee. So keep that in mind. Next time you have that kind of feeling, and then you start hearing that telltale sound of the fluttering of birds, then that's where you're running into, or you were at least in the nearby area of a banshee. If you want a more physical proof of it, is this. Apparently the banshee has a comb. I don't know why they have a comb with them. Maybe they have it in their hair and it just happens to be stuck. But either way, though, this comb falls off. And so it's considered bad luck even to this day, especially in Ireland and other places there. If you go you see a comb on the floor, it seems to be the notion that there was a banshee that dropped this comb by accident. So that's why people don't pick it up. And it's considered bad luck to do so within those areas. Now, as far as the origins of the banshee, and where it could be truly placed, like where they originated from, it could be this. Apparently, as far back as the 8th century, there was a tradition, an old Irish tradition, where women would sing whenever they would have a funeral. So if somebody was, let's say, dead, and there was people around, or maybe even a large amount of people, or more importantly, a small amount of people, you could almost, I guess the way I read it is you could almost hire these women to have like singing done at the funeral to make it seem like this person was more important. And it was the idea that these women would do so, and then they would get paid by alcohol. And this was apparently something that was frowned upon, considering the sacredness of the funeral. Like, nobody should be being paid for that stuff. Nobody should be making a mockery of it as well, like in terms of given insincere grief, is the way I read it. And so that's the origin, is this: these women were in turn punished for doing this stuff, for being doing this stuff in front of the eyes of God, and they were punished, and they became banshees afterward, almost like in an ironic twist. They in turn became permanent women screaming and singing, because that was their profession when they were living. So they became the undead, and then they will continue to do that, but as a form of a banshee. So that's at least one speculation about where the origin of this banshees came from. And it makes kind of sense, because actually, believe me or not, but there's actually people that you can hire to this day to be professional grievers. These are the people that can show up to a funeral and then, be dressed in the usual funeral blues, and then they'll be able to cry a little bit, and then they'll show grief. And then that way, everyone else, in a weird way, it makes everyone else that's truly there for the funeral feel more comfortable. And in this manner, that, no one else, how there's that thing where it's always like people have to see one person start doing something, and then the rest are more comfortable to do it. That's the what happens here with these professional mourners. So that if it goes back all the way to the 8th century, then yes, then as far as these banshees, they all came from these women who would sing, and then they in turn would become banshees afterward, and then that's where the wail of the banshee is from as well. So interesting little twist. No, now you know a little bit of history associated with the banshee. And another thing is this: there's the notion that they could have been owls transformed into banshees, because there was armies that would approach during the older days of all these battles, all these medieval battles. And then owls will be used to warn when there was some other army advancing, because they would take flight. Remember that fluttering of wings I was mentioning earlier? So they would take flight, and they would have this horrific screech. If you ever heard an owl screech, they are just horrible to hear. And so the idea is that these owls and their screech and their flight were essentially linked to banshees afterward. Now, as I mentioned earlier too, the way I know a banshee is this: comic books. There's the banshee from the DC Comics. Watching the Superman cartoons and then the Superman comics, it's a very well-known supervillain within the comic book world. So that's where I knew the Banshee. And of course, her superpower is, of course, doing that very loud scream that causes a lot of pain. So at least that's where I first heard of the Banshee. So if anyone else has that same origin when you first heard of the Banshee, then let me know. Please post those comments. But what do you guys think as far as the Banshee, this cryptid of the week? Anybody else know any more info I might have missed? Something else that might have been importance that you wanted to share? Then please do so below. Anybody maybe have heard of the Banshee in person? Like if you have, you want to share that experience, let me know too. Maybe you heard something like this horrific screech somewhere out there. Not a Bigfoot screech, not something else, but instead more like a woman's wailing screech, like a banshee, somewhere out there in the distance in the forest or who knows where. Please post those comments below too. So, all right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.